Magnus Carlsen just sacrificed his rook against Hans Niemann. This is not just a rook sacrifice. This is total and complete disrespect. This is Magnus Carlsen asserting his dominance over the new challenger, the man who claims he wants to be the new world champion. What is going on, guys? It is Friday night. It is the Freestyle Friday. Magnus and Hans Niemann are playing some freestyle chess. This game was unbelievable. Again, Magnus disrespecting Hans Niemann. What more could you ask for? Let's dive right in. All right, Hans Niemann, he's playing as white. What does he want to do here? Obviously, the kings are on the starting position, but every other piece is on a ridiculous square. What's it going to be? The strongest moves here, believe it or not, are b4, c4, d4, and g3. In the game, Hans Niemann going d4. He is mostly a 1e4 player these days as white, but when it comes to freestyle chess, he's going 1d4, opening with the rook's pawn. All right, now, Magnus Carlsen, not to be outdone, he goes d5 as well, meeting the pawn in the center, d4 and d5. Now we have g3, opening up the diagonal for the bishop. As you can see, all of the bishops are on the corners of the board. They are pre-moved fianchettoed. Wow, very interesting. And Magnus Carlsen, again, not to be outdone, g6 is the move. Both those bishops on a8 and, h1 and h8, attacking those pawns on e4 and e5. All right, now Hans Niemann, the double fianchetto, b3 is the move, opening up the scope of this bishop on this diagonal here. And finally, Magnus says, you know what? We're not going b6. We're not playing the copycat variation anymore. Instead, we're going c5. The queen's pawn breaks in the center, challenging the white pawn on d4. And now, very importantly, if white goes d takes c5 real fast, you lose the bishop on a1. Hans Niemann already in a bit of trouble. What's he going to be here? What's he going to do? Well, there are a few ways to defend. For example, you can go bishop b2, defending the bishop on b2, therefore threatening d takes c5. Beyond that, you can go c3 immediately, knight to e3, and so on. But in the game, he plays a massive mistake here in this position. Hans Niemann on move 4, he goes c4. This looks logical. We now have the famous pawn triangle in the center of the board, pawn square. You know things are getting serious when the pawn square appears. All these pawns can attack each other, but here Magnus, he says, you know what? I've got things totally under control. D takes c4, but boom, the strongest move. Now queen takes c4, and now knight to e6, developing the knight to the very weird e6 square. But where else is it going to go? g6 being occupied, e6 is closer to the center, and now the knight is threatening knight takes d4. And once again, this pawn on d4 is pinned. If you move it, say d takes c5 or d5, you lose that fianchetto bishop on a1. Therefore, you cannot do that. What is white going to do? In the game, bishop d5 is the move, but here, Magnus Carlsen on move 6. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, it's only move 6, and here Magnus plays the most disrespectful move you will ever see. He goes rook takes d5, the rook sacrifice on move 6 in the opening, in the middle of the board, and Hans Niemann here, he is left totally and completely speechless. What can he do? Well, he takes the rook, queen takes d5 is the move. He's trying to deal with the disrespect, but here Magnus says, I'm not even in a hurry. I'm not even going to waste my time taking on d4. You're not on my level. It's not worth my time. Instead, short castles is the move, getting the king to safety. Yes, in freestyle chess, you can still castle. And here, Hans Niemann, what can he do? Again, the pawn on d4 is pinned. He is in trouble as white right out of the opening. Well, in the game, he goes 8, knight fd2, developing his knight, and black goes knight to c6. Finally, a normal square for one of the pieces. All right, now Hans Niemann, queen to c4 is the move. Once again, if you take on c5, that bishop on a1 is as good as gone. Therefore, instead, queen c4 is the move, getting out of the way of a future rook d8 advance, that being one of the benefits of that short castles move by the GOAT Magnus Carlsen. And by the way, I do want to point out, both these players are rated 29-21 and 29-22. They're literally one ELO point apart in freestyle chess. Freestyle chess is new, and even in freestyle chess, these two players could not be more evenly matched. Very impressive stuff. All right, now knight c takes d4 is the move for the GOAT. Very good, recapturing towards the center with the knight. And Hans says, you know what? It is finally time to get rid of my artificially fianchettoed bishop on a1. Bishop takes d4 is the move. Then knight takes d4, and then knight to a3. Developing the knight, maybe intending knight b5, knight c4, something like that. We'll have to wait and see what Hans Niemann has in mind here. All right, Magnus Carlsen, b6 is the move, bolstering c5, opening up the scope for this bishop, maybe even intending queen h3 in the near future. These light squares are just so weak on the king side, and what is Hans Niemann gonna do? If he castles, again, queen h3 is gonna be deadly, threatening checkmate on g2, therefore short castles is not advised. Instead, Hans goes knight b5, showing the idea of knight to a3 played earlier in the game. Now we have knight takes b5, then queen takes b5, and then sure enough here, Magnus, his spidey senses are tingling. He goes queen to h3, flying down with the queen. All right, queen d3 chosen by Hans. He's trying to retreat, trying to defend, but he forgot in the process, you give up the pawn on h2. And here Magnus says, you know what? Queen takes h2. We're winning that pawn. We're hitting the rook. Magnus is finally even in material. Magnus has the extra 2 pawns on the c file and the h file versus the extra exchange, that being the rook for the bishop for Hans Niemann. But of course, his rooks on d1 and g1 are about as useless as, what's a good example? They're about as useful as my devilish good looks when I spend all my time not pursuing a girlfriend and instead doing chess videos for you guys on a Friday night. All right, now rook to f1 is the move, getting the rook out of the attack of the queen. Now queen to h3, Magnus being relentless, maybe intending the queen sacrifice. I don't know. All right, Hans Niemann, knight f3. He's not messing around, developing his knight, and now, of course, the bishop on a8 has the option of trading for that knight on f3. The pre-fianchetto bishop may finally have something useful to do in this game. All right, now, instead of taking on f3, bishop c6 is the move. What is the idea of that move? Honestly, I'm not sure. The bishop not really that much more active on c6 over a8. Maybe the idea is stopping queen d7 threats from white. Now here, Hans Niemann, rook to g1. He moves the rook back and forth, back and forth. Hans Niemann, what are you doing with this rook? I'm not sure. Queen to e6 is the move. Dropping back with the queen is the GOAT. Now, king to f1. Perhaps Hans Niemann artificially castling his king. Where's he gonna go? Bishop f6 is the move for Magnus. And now king g2. Hans Niemann completing the artificial castling of the king, voluntarily pinning his knight on f3 to the king on g2. Hans Niemann, what is the idea behind this move? I don't know. And here, Magnus Carlsen, he unleashes a very, very aggressive move. He says, I am going to punish Hans Niemann immediately for this pin, for the voluntary king march. He goes g5, threatening g4, at which point the knight on f3 would be lost as that knight again is pinned to the king. So what does Hans Niemann do? He says, we're going back. King to f1 is the move. Hans Niemann going king f1, g2, and then back to f1. And it turns out, in response to g5, this is the strongest move. And now what do we have? Queen to h3, hits the king again, and then king to e1. Hans Niemann, the king, going king e1 to f2, to g2, to f1, and then back, if I can draw arrows correctly, to the e1 square, back to where it started. All right, queen to e6. Magnus retreats the queen, and Hans says, let's keep going, buddy. Let's keep going. King to f1, intending king g2. Magnus, king g7. He's mirroring Hans Niemann, and now Hans finally g4, gaining space on the king's side, stopping that g4 threat once and for all. Maybe the king will go to g2 after all. All right, now here, Magnus, h6 is the move, bolstering g5. That pawn will not be taken anytime soon. And finally, Hans Niemann says, you know what? I am sick and tired of these queens. Queen to c4. He offers the queen trade. And here, the greatest endgame player of all time, that being, of course, Magnus Carlsen. He takes on c4. Queen takes c4. B takes c4. And now we have a very highly imbalanced endgame. Black having, let's see, the rook, the 2 bishops, and 2 extra pawns versus the knight and 2 rooks of white. Technically, this is about even material, but according to Larry Kaufman, the senior grandmaster, he says the bishop pair is worth roughly half a pawn, and that means black is up roughly half a pawn in this position. All right, here, Magnus, a6, intending b5, marching his queenside pawn majority down the board. Now Hans Niemann, king to g2. He went king e1, f2, g2, f1, e1, f1, g2. My goodness. All right, b5, expanding on the queen side is the goat. Now c takes, a takes, and finally, we're sort of resembling a normal game despite starting out as freestyle chess. Now here, Hans Niemann, he makes a critical mistake. He moves the king again, this time not to f1, but instead king g3, and this is a massive blunder. It's too slow. Hans Niemann, what are you doing? Rook to a8 is the move by the goat. Rook a8, it flies over, it pressures a2, and there's no easy way to defend that pawn on the a2 square. Rook d2 tries to defend, but now we have c4 gaining space. All right, e3 is the move. Now c3, marching that pawn down the board, pressure threatening c2 and c1. What will Hans Niemann do to stop it? Rook to e2 is the move. Getting out of the attack is one of my favorite chess players here. Now b4 is the move. Magnus gaining space on the queen side. Rook b1 threatens that pawn on b4. Now we have bishop b5, pressures the rook on e2. Hans Niemann, rook e1, he tries to defend. Rook to a4, jumping down, defending along the fourth rank with that pawn on b4. Hans Niemann is still in the game. All right, e4, here we go, threatening e5, gaining space, but it turns out not so good of a move despite looking dangerous. Now c2, threatening the rook on the b1 square. Rook b to c1, stepping out of the attack, pressuring c2, but now we have bishop c3 before Hans Niemann can even take on c2. The rook on the e1 square is under attack. Now rook takes c2, bishop d3. Magnus Carlsen, he is relentless. The bishop on c3 is defended, and now the bishop's cut off every square along the fourth rank. All right, rook takes, wait a minute, Hans Niemann, rook takes c3, the counter rook sacrifice. Hans Niemann, don't you know rook to e2 is the right move here? What a weird looking move. Instead, rook takes c3 chosen in the game. The idea being he gives back the rook, the counter rook sacrifice, after the unbelievably disrespectful 6 rook takes d5 right out of the opening. Instead here, rook takes c3, the counter rook sacrifice. Now we have b takes c3, rook to e3, pressures the bishop and the pawn behind it. But here, Magnus Carlsen, does he defend the bishop? No, he does not. He goes c2, marching the pawn. The point being, if you take the bishop, you get a new queen on c1 or a knight, whatever you want. Rook to e1, Hans Niemann trying to defend, but now we have bishop takes e4. This is getting ugly, my friends. Magnus is now officially up 2 pawns in the endgame. That being let's see, extra e pawn and h pawn, 2 pawns on the king side, plus the pawn on c2, very far advanced, and the pawn on a2, that pawn is as good as gone. All right, now knight d2 hits the bishop on e4. Hans Niemann, my favorite chess player, trying to fight back. Bishop g6, it retreats. Knight b3, the knight shuffles over. And by the way, Pragnana, if you're watching this, don't feel so bad. You're still my favorite Indian chess player, but Hans Niemann, he's got to take the cake as my favorite overall chess player. This guy is a fighter. All right, rook takes a2, wins the pawn on the a2 square, knight to c1, dropping back with the knight. Rook a1, pressures the knight on c1. Now f3, the reverse Ben Feingold counterattack. Now e6, king f2, h5, Magnus gaining space on the king side. He has too many pawns. He is out of control. G takes h5 is the move. Bishop takes h5, king to e3, jumping up with the king. Now we have rook to a3 check. And by the way, I forgot to add the timers to this game. I'm going to add them just at the very end here so you can guys see the crazy time scramble we're in. Hans Niemann having 7 seconds left on the clock versus just 9 seconds for Magnus Carlsen. By the way, my apologies. Let's keep going. King d2 in the game, pressuring the pawn on c2. Now we have rook takes f3, king takes c2, but now Magnus Carlsen with 9 seconds left on the clock, 3 passed pawns on the king side. You don't have to be a very stable chess genius like Magnus Carlsen to convert 3 extra pass pawns against Hans Niemann. G4 is the move, king D2, then G3. Magnus is relentless. All right, knight D3, Hans Niemann fighting back. F6, the bend, fine, go counterattack. Here we go. Rook G1 is the move, pressuring G3 with the rook. Then bishop G6, knight E1, pressures the rook on F3. The rook must move. Rook to A3, chosen in the game. Knight G2, marching the knight up. Then E5. There is no stopping these pawns. Knight E3, G2. Now here, Hans Niemann, he finally wins a pawn. Knight takes G2, but Magnus goes rook to G3. And now there is nothing stopping the conversion to a king and pawn endgame after king E2, bishop E4. And in this position, Hans Niemann resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Here's why. After king F2, you just go rook takes G2, rook takes, bishop takes, king takes, and then king to G6, intending king F5. Then you march the pawns down the board. There's nothing stopping those pawns. Magnus will win this with his eyes closed. Therefore, Hans Niemann, he resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen and his unbelievably disrespectful rook sacrifice, 6 rook takes D5. Magnus making this statement right out of the opening. What a game, Chess YouTube. That's all I got. Wow, what a game. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, show me some love, smash that like button for me, and comment down below what you thought of the rook sacrifice in this freestyle chess game right out of the opening. Rook takes D5. What an unbelievable move. I mean, to me, this is not just a rook sacrifice. It's not just an exchange sacrifice. It is a statement. Again, Magnus saying, come on, little boy, you are not in my league, despite being within one ELO point of me in freestyle chess. That 1 point makes all the difference. I have no respect for you. Rook takes D5, giving up the rook in the opening. You gotta love it. And Magnus, you gotta give it to him. He backed it up in this game. All right, Chess YouTube, if you want to see more Hans Niemann versus Magnus Carlsen action, check out this video right here where I cover literally 5, that's right, 5 of the very best games played between Hans Niemann and Magnus Carlsen at the 2024 Speed Chess Championships. It's like well over an hour, maybe close to 2 hours of incredible chess action. I think it's around like an hour and 40 minutes roughly. If you want to see more Hans versus Magnus action, that is the video for you. So check it out, and I'll see you in the next video.